When dealing with processes and quality management, there are many different process models out there that we use to control or think about or use as meta-analysis for the way we approach processes. There's the big models like Lean Enterprise, Lean Thinking, and Six Sigma and ISO 9000. Those are all very, very helpful, but in specialized situations, it pays to have your own models that you develop over time. So this process continuum model is simply one that I use when I'm looking at processes and working with organizations, trying to understand their processes better and to recognize patterns that I can apply, heuristics, when I'm working on building and developing processes. So what I do is I look at all the products or services that I'm working on and put them along a continuum, and I try to identify where would the products or services of this organization or this function or this company fall. So on one end of the continuum, you've got completely personalized products. They're one-offs. They're actually delivered to people as they go through. At the left side of the continuum, I've got things that are more similar, perhaps mass-produced products. So there's a range or a continuum of products that are out there, from the completely personalized to the completely similar, maybe with some customized or tailored types of products or services in between. Another dimension I then look at is the way work is organized, the way processes are carried out. On the one extreme, completely professional type products, the way we refer to professions, lawyers, accountants, doctors, things that through their knowledge they can apply their skills, and they have to do it in a very individual way. So the professional is actually working on a process. At the other end of the continuum is maybe a continuous process, a manufacturing process that runs on an assembly line or a mass production kind of environment. So this continuum exists for work processes, with perhaps some kind of a job shop or a piecemeal kind of activity somewhere around the middle of the continuum. A third dimension that I look at is how quality is checked, or how checks are processed across the continuum. On the right side of the continuum is simply intent controls. You can't really measure sometimes the exact levels of quality in a process because it's all in the eye of the beholder. So what did you think of the transaction? Or were you satisfied when you were there? Did things generally go the way you want? So measuring people's intent. Over on the other end of the continuum, literal control. You can actually go out and measure whether something complies with its specifications. Measure whether things are literally where they're supposed to be as they go through. The fourth dimension of this model, fourth and final, is the level of customer involvement. At one end of the involvement, the product only works if you've got very, very heavy involvement from the customer. The customer has to be actively involved. It's hard for an architect to design you a home if you're not heavily involved in the process. It's hard for a doctor to diagnose your disease if you're not personally and heavily involved in the process. Over to the other end of the continuum, where there are minimal controls required, the customer is really not involved in the process at all. When you go to the store and buy something off the shelf at Target, you had almost no involvement in the creation of that product coming through. And somewhere along the way, you might have an iterative kind of process, maybe checkpoints where you check in with your customers periodically to see how things are going. So these are the four dimensions that I use to think about a process in an organization. And they really measure a continuum of activities that go on. The implications of the model on the right-hand side are we're dealing with a side of process that deals with very small numbers. You can measure it through survey and analysis, and the knowledge of the process is largely embedded in the people, either the professional performing the service or the customer being heavily involved. But a lot of this stuff goes on inside people's heads. At the other end of the continuum, you have very large numbers. You tend to measure things very directly and use statistics to draw conclusions, and the knowledge of the process and the activities tend to be embedded in the tools. Now, it's untrue that a process in your organization would be at one place on this continuum. It could be at the far right, a personalized, professional, heavily customer-focused, intent-controlled process. On the far right side, similar mass-produced processes produced in a continuous way using literal controls and minimal customer involvement. But it's not necessarily true that a given process is at the same left-right position in all of these continuums. So you get to apply this as you go through. Here's a mapping of some functions in a typical organization as they might fall across these continuums today from a classic industrial type organization. On the far right, you've got research and development, which is really still a one-off, heavily customer involved professional activity where you do the process, but you don't really know where it's going to go and where it's going to end up. At the far right, left, we've got the very, very similar manufacturing, mass production type of operations. And in between, we've got other functions in the business, logistics and distribution. It's probably more automated than not these days, but not nearly as much as manufacturing. You've got customer service somewhere in the middle. You call up a help desk, and they're giving you relatively customized or tailored activity, but they're working from standard scripts like in a job shop kind of environment. So you can take the processes in an organization and place them along the continuum. It's important to be able to do that because that's what determines how you can make a change. So typically most organizations are trying to move their processes to the left to make them cheaper to operate and faster to carry out. But at the same time, they're trying to optimize or maximize requirements and flexibility for the customers, which would tend to move them to the right. So there's a friction here in terms of where you fall. So the first step when you're working on a process would be for each of these dimensions, figure out where you are in the continuum. And then the next step is to figure out for the change you're looking to introduce, which direction on these dimensions are you looking to move them. And you're not always looking to move them in the same direction or the same amount each time. So it's just something to consider as you look at processes.